Britain, 1945. The sky was grey with smoke and ticker tape, the enemy defeated, the victory declared. And yet, beneath the applause, the silence of debt and insolvency. The treasury was empty, the gold reserves depleted, and the myth of imperial endurance stretched thin across a shattered Europe. Newspapers declared triumph, victory in Europe. Churchill saved civilization. But behind every headline was a shadow. Debt. Quiet. Growing. Undeniable. The war cost £25 billion, more than any government had imagined possible. Overseas assets sold off. Sterling weakened. Production decimated. The British government owed more than it had ever owed before. More than double the value of everything the country could produce in a year. It was called the national debt. But no one really understood what it meant. Ministers convened in private rooms, not to debate vision, but to do arithmetic. Britain turned to its ally, its creditor, the United States. The Anglo-American loan, £3.75 billion, the largest ever granted. Economists called it necessary. Politicians called it partnership. But Keynes, the architect of modern economics, called it humiliation. He wrote in frustration, "We have been driven to the worst possible outcome by the US Treasury. The financial terms are appalling." He returned home exhausted. He died months later. Some blamed his heart, others the weight of diplomatic defeat. With the money secured, the government turned toward hope, a new social contract, a post-war Britain rebuilt from the ashes of empire. The Beveridge Report had laid the foundations. Now it was time to build. The National Health Service was born, schools restructured, the welfare state designed. Council homes emerged from craters. It was visionary, and it was expensive. Debt wasn't feared, it was embraced. Because what mattered was purpose. The government borrowed not just from America, but from its own future. And so began the architecture. And so with a staggering amount of debt around 249% of GDP. A number so large, it was assumed it could never be paid back. But it didn't have to be. The war had ended, but the rebuilding had only begun. Factories stood dormant, railways crumbled, cities needed stitches, not statues. The government reached not for celebration, but for calculators. In Westminster, the tone was pragmatic, emotionally drained, financially drained. They summoned a new economic vision, one that would wrap society in policy. The Beveridge Report, published in 1942, was no longer theory. It became blueprint. It promised to abolish 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. But giants can't be slayed for free. The government expanded its borrowing, not to pay for war, but for peace. 1948, the birth of the NHS, universal healthcare funded not by excess, but by hope. Every hospital a covenant, every diagnosis a budget line. From 1945 to 1955, over 1 million council homes were built, a roof over every working family. Subsidies flowed, industries nationalized, public ownership became patriotic. And behind it all, gilts, long-dated securities, and mounting obligations. Debt remained near 200% of GDP, but that wasn't the headline. Optimism was the currency, and the welfare state was the collateral. The new Labour government nationalised industries, created the NHS, and taxed the rich at over 90%. And the debt, to everyone's surprise, began to shrink. Because something remarkable happened. The debt began to fall not because it was paid off, but because Britain changed how it lived. In 1951, the Conservatives returned to power, but the consensus held. National insurance contributions grew, pension schemes extended. Rationing lingered. Butter, meat, fuel, still measured in ounces and shillings. But public trust in the state grew. Bureaucracy was no longer a barrier, it was a balm. Yet some economists warned, this trajectory has limits. Growth can't outpace repayment forever. Keynes was gone, but his legacy shaped every budget. The Treasury issued long-term gilts to restructure wartime debts. Interest was paid annually. Principal rolled forward. A nation surviving on rollover optimism. The term fiscal drag emerged. Government income grew with inflation, but so did expectations. Consumer culture began to creep in. Radios, refrigerators, weekends at the coast. Credit availability expanded. Hire purchase plans popularized. Middle-class identity became financialized. Behind the scenes, the sterling crisis of 1957. Confidence in the pound slipped. Foreign exchange reserves declined. Macmillan's government quietly injected liquidity into the system. But the illusion of control remained. Ministers reassured the public. Economists recalibrated models. Debt was now not just a necessity, it was ideology. To govern was to borrow was to build, and to build was to promise. The British government engaged in stop-go policies, stimulate growth, then tighten spending. The economy sputtered through cycles, and yet the debt endured. 1961. The UK applied to join the European Economic Community, hoping access would reduce economic volatility. France said no. De Gaulle vetoed entry. Britain remained economically isolated, but it continued to borrow. In homes, debt transformed lifestyle. Mortgages were normalized. Credit was discreet. The average citizen didn't talk about sovereign debt, but lived within its contours. By the late 1960s, inflation began to stir. Wages chased prices, and policymakers blamed external factors. But beneath it all, compounding obligations. Every policy had a price, every promise a repayment schedule. And yet the people believed. Britain was rebuilding, slowly, in debt, but with dignity. By the 1970s, the dream was fracturing. Inflation soared into double digits. The pound collapsed. Union strikes turned cities into hushed battlegrounds. Debt looked like it was falling, but it wasn't. It was simply being inflated away. Rubbish piled high in London's streets. Electricity became intermittent. Candlelight returned not as romance, but necessity. Britain felt ancient again. Fragile, provincial, unpredictable. In 1976, the government faced the impossible. Currency markets attacked sterling. The UK had no fiscal defense. Officials boarded flights to Washington, not for diplomacy, but for debt. The International Monetary Fund granted £2.3 billion, emergency financing, but the price was sovereignty. Public expenditure was cut, welfare scaled back, austerity whispered its first verses. Britain was rebuilding, but underneath it all, the economy was being quietly distorted. The illusion of wealth was maintained by suppressing interest rates and controlling the flow of money. Economists called it financial repression. Prime Minister Callaghan addressed the nation. He said, "We used to think you could spend your way out of a recession. I tell you in all candor, that option no longer exists." It wasn't just a policy reversal, it was a philosophical one. The consensus cracked. Debt, once a tool for building the nation, had become something to fear, something to avoid. Yet it remained, beneath the rhetoric, waiting. Then, in 1979, came Margaret Thatcher. She had no patience for consensus. She believed in markets, not ministers. Government spending became suspect. National ownership, criminal. Thatcher sold what Britain had built: British gas, British steel, British rail, council homes. The proceeds didn't erase the debt, but they reshaped who carried it. She called it liberation, but debt just changed hands. From government ledgers to personal calculators, the rise of private debt began quietly. Homeowners were cheered as self-made citizens, credit cards branded as freedom, financial products flooded dinner tables, banks expanded lending, interest rates became invisible until they weren't. Debt became cultural, emotional, subtle. In classrooms, students started borrowing for education. Grants were phased out. Loans arrived in envelopes. In homes, parents used credit to fund Christmas, holidays, survival. It wasn't shameful. It was advertised. Debt wasn't just tolerated, it was marketed as identity. Meanwhile, the City of London transformed. The Big Bang of 1986 deregulated financial markets. Trading floors became algorithmic, banking became global, and British debt, now financialized, became exportable. Gilts were sold across continents. Treasury bills repackaged in derivatives. Britain no longer owed itself. It owed strangers. In the Commons, politicians declared victory. Growth had returned. The economy was flexible, responsive, light. But debt hadn't gone. It had gone silent. The illusion of control was complete. GDP figures climbed, but so did overdraft fees. Bond yields stabilized, but family budgets didn't. The macro looked healthy. The micro felt breathless. The press celebrated deregulation. The working class celebrated mortgages. Debt became democratic, accessible, invisible. By the early 1990s, household debt had tripled. Consumer confidence was a new economic indicator. And the state retreated from its previous role. No longer provider, now arbiter. Borrowing was no longer collective. It was private, intimate, psychological. And the story shifted with it. Debt had stopped being about infrastructure. It had become personality. And in that mirage, the government claimed success. Because metrics improved, and metrics do not weep. By the dawn of the new millennium, debt had become atmosphere. No longer a problem to be solved, but a texture woven through public life. Tony Blair called it modernization. Gordon Brown called it prudence. And yet the numbers moved only in one direction. Public investment surged, but not through taxes, through contracts, public-private partnerships, PFI, funded hospitals, schools, libraries. It looked innovative, efficient, transparent, but the numbers were elsewhere. Decades of repayments, escalating costs, hidden liabilities. Debt disappeared from official ledgers, but multiplied in shadows. The illusion of thrift, engineered through accounting. In homes, families borrowed more. House prices soared, mortgage terms lengthened, credit became cultural. Debt was no longer stigma, it was a rite of passage. Students, now saddled with tuition loans, graduated into an economy designed around repayment. The government applauded rising GDP, but underneath, anxiety. Then came 2008. The crash was not unexpected, but it was unprepared for. Lehman Brothers fell, markets convulsed, British banks wavered, Northern Rock collapsed, RBS teetered, the government intervened. £137 billion committed, not to citizens, but to systems. Once again, debt became salvation. A national bailout, a global echo, and then austerity. Framed as responsibility, framed as moral clarity, David Cameron and George Osborne presented the budget like punishment wrapped in sacrifice. Libraries shut, councils shrank. The NHS stretched to breaking point. Debt was blamed, but never questioned. Its necessity repeated, its morality assumed. Behind the headlines, another silence grew. mental health crises, food banks normalized, rent swallows wages. But the bond market remained stable, as if numbers could erase feeling. The press cheered fiscal discipline. Experts debated the deficit, but rarely the ideology beneath it. Then came 2020. COVID-19 swept across the world. Streets emptied, hospitals overflowed. And suddenly, the state returned. £400 billion borrowed for furlough schemes, vaccines, PPE, bailouts. Debt surged again, but this time, no apology. Even free market politicians admitted there was no alternative. The public embraced it, temporarily. Debt became moral again, but only briefly. By 2021, familiar voices re-emerged. Warnings of inflation, calls for cuts, talk of unsustainable borrowing. The old narrative returned, repackaged. Restraint, realism, responsibility. And yet the total UK public debt crossed £2.5 trillion, more than double its size a decade earlier. In 2022, Liz Truss tried to trick the system one more time. But this time, the markets said no. The pound crashed, yields spiked, and Britain was hours from collapse. Interest on the debt surged. By 2024, Britain was spending over £100 billion a year on interest alone. More than on schools, more than on police, more than on transport. No mass protest, no political collapse. Just quiet adjustment, a new normal. Budgets become emotional theatre, each speech a ritual of denial and deflection. In homes, nothing changed. Rent increased, energy bills soared, credit cards maxed. But national debt was ambient, too big to feel, too abstract to touch. The state, once built from debt, now simply lived in it. Debt was no longer urgent, it was permanent. And the illusion of control reaffirmed. Debt begins as a promise, a transaction, an exchange of now for tomorrow. But over time it becomes something else. A rhythm, a religion, a regime. Britain no longer debates debt. It absorbs it, like oxygen, like news, like noise. In government buildings, debt is reported quarterly, in headlines annually, in lives constantly. But there is a silence beneath the systems, a silence that grows louder each year. We borrow to survive, to educate, to heal, to govern. But we seldom ask. From whom? The answer is increasingly abstract. Bond markets, institutional investors, central banks. Names with no faces, systems with no exit. They lend because we have lent before, because debt has become tradition. A legacy passed across parliaments and generations. Children are born into debt not of their own making. Their schools funded by unseen obligations, their futures shaped by unchosen repayments. Debt decides curricula, housing policy, climate budgets, defense contracts. It decides who leads and who follows. And still it remains unspoken, because to speak of it is to risk clarity, and clarity is dangerous. Every time Britain faces crisis, debt returns as savior. From war, from collapse, from pandemic. It is summoned without ceremony and erased from memory. But what if it cannot be erased? What if the numbers have grown larger than the choices they allow? Because this is the ghost we live with, not in haunted buildings, but in fiscal architecture. Debt is the machine, quietly humming beneath democracy. And the illusion of control, that's the haunting. Politicians debate, voters choose, but debt decides. Budgets become moral codes. Ledgers become laws. Each year the Treasury presents its figures, balanced, calculated, predicted, but they do not show the feeling. The feeling of owing, the feeling of limitation, the slow shrinking of possibility. Interest is paid monthly, but doubt is paid daily. And Britain continues forward, tied to the architecture it cannot see. Buildings funded by contracts no citizen reads. Roads built with borrowed ambition. The future written in spreadsheets. Some call this efficiency, others call it inevitability, but few call it freedom. Because freedom without solvency is theatre, and solvency is now a moving target. History once turned on revolutions, on votes, on protests. Now it pivots on interest rates. And history doesn't repeat, it calculates. In compound interest, in rising balances, in a nation still ruled, not by kings, but by creditors. Today, Britain's debt exceeds £2.5 trillion, more than twice what it was a decade prior. Interest payments alone swallow key public services, schools, police, transport. The nation lives in a debt-driven illusion of control. Debt began as a promise, an exchange of now for tomorrow. But over time, it became a silent regime, governing us from beneath the surface, shaping our policies, our lives, our futures. Britain's debt isn't just numbers on a ledger. It's the ghost haunting its democracy, whispering that perhaps true freedom lies not in control, but in understanding the debt we carry. Is the debt just going to increase forever? How long is this sustainable? Debt was a savior, debt was a burden, debt was a promise, and debt was a lie. It moved unseen through parliaments and households, binding generations in obligations they never chose. And if debt decides, what does democracy mean? When the real power lies not in votes, but in the creditors we cannot see. Because in the end, it was never the people who ruled. It was the debt. 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 It was the debt.